I've always wanted to learn the new edition dance moves.
You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily podcast on fantasy basketball. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd and you can find me on Twitter as always at redrock_bball. We are back with another season preview podcast. I believe this is the last one that I am releasing, so number 30 in the books. Congratulations for getting through all of them. To join me to talk about this last team that we're going to talk about is the host of the Locked On Pistons podcast, and that is Matt Schoch. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Josh, for having me. Appreciate it.
It's an interesting team to talk about with some interesting position battles, some injuries, of course, to always go over with this Pistons team. But there is some fantasy value to be had on this squad and some things that we definitely need to break down. But let's start, Matt, where I start with all of these podcasts. And again, in true Locked On podcast host tradition, you have gone with the over for the projected record. You've gone at 44-38. Vegas has the Pistons sitting at 38.5. I do think they can get over that number, but you've gone fairly high above that number. What's the reason there? Is it the Dwane Casey factor? Is it a full season of Blake Griffin? Is it maybe a healthy season from Reggie Jackson? Or is it a combination of all those things?
Yeah, I think the health is pretty much the thing that you're gambling on if you're going with the over. That you think that I think the Eastern Conference got a little bit worse and the Pistons got a little bit better when you upgrade to Casey as coach, and you get Blake Griffin in there for a whole year. Now, of course, an injury to Blake Griffin, an injury to Reggie Jackson, to expect some at least minor injuries to happen, even if you're an optimistic Pistons fan. If those things come through and they're able to skate through without getting those major injuries, you got to believe that this is a team that's at least an 8 seed, maybe on the fringe of the playoffs, or possibly getting up to as high as maybe a 6 seed, something like that.
Yeah, so there is quite a bit of change happening. Some of that change happened during last season, of course, with that Blake Griffin trade, and that does take us on to the projected leading scorer on this team. Matt, you've gone with Blake Griffin there. He, I'd say that's pretty much guaranteed. He averaged over 21 points per game last season. Not much to suggest that he won't be in that similar range this season. Injury-wise, he did miss the end of last season with an ankle problem, but no one's really considering that to be too much of a problem. But broken hands, knee problems, continuing issues through the last 4 or 5 seasons of Blake Griffin's career make him always somewhat of a risky bet in fantasy. Yahoo's got him ranked 42nd for this coming season. He was the 45th ranked player last year. I can see him being probably a little bit worse than that, but he has shown an ability to do numerous things, and in addition to being the leading scorer on this team, Matt, I think he's probably going to be the actual highest guy in terms of assists as well. He hits threes, but what is he going to be able to do that maybe he wasn't able to do last season with a full preseason in Detroit and with this squad?
Yeah, well, Dwane Casey talked about it in his intro press conference that he's going to be running the offense through Blake Griffin in a lot of ways. And like you said, those assist numbers went up to 6.2 assists per game during his 25-game stretch with the Pistons. And I expect it to be right around there again, maybe in the 5s if you have Reggie Jackson playing alongside of him, who's going to be a little bit more ball dominant when he needs to be in there as well. So, but Blake Griffin's going to get plenty of options to kind of show off his playmaking. And obviously with the overlap of big men that they have with Andre Drummond there, that he's going to have to step away from the basket a little bit. He showed an ability at times to knock down three-pointers. He was at 34.8% last year, shooting about 2 a game and shooting about 5 a game and knocking down about 2 of them. That's pretty high, especially from a guy who is really his three-point abilities and even shooting them at all is something that it hasn't happened throughout his career up until last year. He's trying to adjust to the modern game and become a guy who can extend his career quite a bit, because as you've seen, those injuries, even if he doesn't miss a lot of games with some of these injuries he's had in the past, if something freak doesn't crop up again, which we've become accustomed to with Blake Griffin, the accumulation of all those other injuries that you've mentioned over the years have made him a lot, less explosive of a player. It doesn't take much watching him in 2018 to notice that this is not the same guy. Clearly, there was a out of Oklahoma for the Clippers early in his career. That was the jumping guy, jumping over the cars famously, or not really quite over a car, but as you would call yourself there in the slam dunk contest. So not exactly that same guy, not nearly that same guy, but trying to adjust to a new phase of his career. But like you mentioned, in addition to the assist numbers possibly staying a little bit level, the rebounding numbers for him have gone down each season in his career. I expect that to stay around maybe 7 or 8 in line because as his career moved on with the Clippers, he had DeAndre Jordan that was becoming more into his own and playing more minutes there. He's going to have a similar rebounder with Andre Drummond next to him in the post there. So really rebounding becomes less and less of his responsibility. And for fantasy folks, something to keep an eye on is that his numbers won't be there.
The rebound numbers are considerably lower. We've seen that he used to be a guy that was getting 10 boards per game. Now he's in that 7 mark. He still does contribute right across the board. The assists are really, really interesting. He's never going to get blocks. He's never going to get steals. Be aware of that. He's improved his free throws a lot. He's not a drain in that category anymore. In fact, he can be even a marginal positive in his free throw shooting. But he sort of is what he is. He's that guy in the mid-rounds who is a significant injury risk. And I'd probably let him slide maybe a round or two later, depending on who's available there in that spot, just because of that risk. And again, some of his injuries are a concern, the knee stuff, but weird like infections in his elbow, broken hands from punching his mates in the face, just random stuff that is unlikely to be able to continue, but he just keeps having these random things happen to him. And that's where we have, I guess, the level of concern with Griffin. The other injury, Matt, on this Pistons team is the tackle box, John Lua, who missed nearly all of last season with an injury and now has had another knee surgery, a fresh injury, a meniscus injury. The reports are he should be back around that training camp mark. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's what we've heard. The latest from Vince Ellis of the Detroit Free Press is that they're hopeful that he's able to be, and that they're certainly pretty positive that with this injury in and of itself, that he would certainly not miss any time in the regular season.
Now, Lou is a guy that, I'm not massively high on him as a player. He is a guy that's probably best suited to play the 5, of course, with Griffin at the 4 now. There's not as much time there. Do you think that they brought in Zaza Pachulia? Do you think that Lua, if healthy, is an every-night player in this rotation, or will he be the 5th big man behind Drummond, behind Pachulia, behind Griffin, and behind maybe even Allenson or Robinson or Johnson as the backup 4 there? Like, where is John Lua fitting in on this team after, I guess, a really hot streak at one point for about half a season and then a couple of years of being terrible?
Yeah, he was really good for the first half of his first year with Detroit, and then really bad for the second half of that first year. And then pretty much played the first week of the season very badly last year, and then missed the whole rest of the year with the ankle injury. So, I mean, I think that based on the amount of money that they're paying him, they would expect him to be playing a lot of minutes and to be one of those first guys off the bench in the front court. And I think he's going to get that opportunity, especially early on, to do just that. Now, he's missed a lot of basketball over this past calendar year, obviously, and it remains to be seen how quickly he's able to get that. But it's something to remember from how poorly he played in his first season with the Pistons in the second half of that year, is he was a complete liability as a three-point shooter, which is something that Stan Van Gundy had hoped that he would be with some of the numbers he was putting up in Phoenix that drew that big contract to him in the summer of 2016, when all sorts of players were getting ridiculous deals.
People lost their mind, I think, is the phrase you're looking for.
Yeah, people lost their minds, and Stan Van Gundy was one of those people that lost their minds, and Lure got, I believe $44 million out of that. So, you're going to probably be able to tell early on what you're going to get from him as far as a guy who can maybe knock down a shot, or as a guy who completely lost his confidence at the end of last season. But I think that as far as the beginning of the season, he's going to get the opportunity to win those minutes, to be that guy. And Dwane Casey had something that he's been heralded, and something in Toronto that he did well, was be able to work with bench guys and get them out there. Now, obviously, a lot of the credit has to go to those bench guys in particular, but there's something to be said for a coach who sticks with bench guys and who's able to get those guys in positions for them to succeed, drawing out their strengths and maybe drowning out their weaknesses a little bit, and having them able to do what they do best on the court, and giving them the amount of minutes that they need to be successful as well. So I think that they're going to give him a chance, and he's probably, as far as the pecking order, I think Ellenson's further down the road in terms of maybe more of a backup plan. Zaza's a guy who's going to be a body. He's going to be, asked to spell Drummond against larger players, but we know that there's not a whole lot of teams that are throwing out traditional fives that need to be combated defensively. So I think Zaza's a little bit further down the pecking order than Lure as well. So the minutes will be there, and it depends on what John Lure you think is going to show up. If you're a Stan Van Gundy believer in the contract that he gave him, you might want to think about inserting him into some sort of rotation of yours. But I think that you kind of got to let him prove it before you pick him up.
Yeah, I think he's bad, and I think that he'll prove that once again. But we'll see. He had half a season of decent play, and then he struggled after that. But we'll see exactly how that pans out. In terms of breakout player for this season, Matt, you have gone with a guy that makes me excited to hear you say that, and that is Luke Kennard, who I thought was excellent last season. I thought was dicked around by Stan Van Gundy pretty significantly, considering a rookie coming in shooting 42% from three, being able to handle the ball, being a contributor defensively. He's always going to be maligned because Donovan Mitchell was picked one after him. It's got nothing to do with him. He is still a very, very solid, and I think he's going to be a good NBA player, but that shit is going to be put on him consistently because of the guy that got picked after him. But Mitchell on the brain. Kennard, I think, looks to project to have a much bigger role this season. Now, whether he does start or not remains to be seen. But what are you looking at extra from a guy that played 20 minutes per game last season? Is he moving into a key role in this team, or is it going to be one of those? And that's the issue I have here with the shooting guard and small forward positions is there's like four guys, and I feel like they're all going to get minutes in the mid-20s. Is Kennard a guy that can maybe push forward and ahead of those other three guys in the mix there?
Yeah, I think so. And not only just getting those minutes, but I think they're going to be valuable ones because I think he's going to be asked to do a lot with that second unit. I would presume that Reggie Bullock is probably the guy who starts like he did for most of last year, and that Luke Kennard's going to kind of be maybe featured a little bit with that bench unit. And that's what Dwane Casey's talked about, and that's what the organization is realized, that they're stuck with the salary cap hell that they have right now with Blake Griffin and Andre Drummond and Reggie Jackson going forward with those high contracts over these next few years. The only way that the Pistons take a step forward and get better is that guys like Luke Kennard make that next step. And they can't do it, like you said, with the way that Stan Van Gundy played around with Luke Kennard's minutes. That's not going to be a way to help him develop and help him turn from a pretty nice rookie to an impact player in your rotation day in and day out. So they're going to give him that chance. And I think that's something he showed his rookie year was he's not just a standstill shooter. He's not just a guy that maybe is going to knock down those 42% of 3-pointers, but a guy whose ability to make plays and be a playmaker out there. And I think with the second unit, he's going to be featured in that way. And I think that as the second half of games come on, he'll be probably sticking around and playing with that first unit a little bit as games wear on as well.
And part of my issue with the way that Van Gundy used Kennard last season is he would come out and say, we need to rely more on Kennard. We're going to give him more minutes. We're going to give him as many minutes as he can handle. Then he traded away Avery Bradley, said the same thing. And then the games after that, Kennard played 19, 12, 18, 17, 6, 16, 4. 2 DMP CDs, and then 5 minutes in that stretch of time, which was absolutely ridiculous for a guy that you're trying to develop after you've just cleared open a spot for him to get into the rotation. To actually sit in those games was nonsense. In the late March, April stretch, he did play more minutes, and he looked at home. And I do think that Kennard is one of those guys that's worth having a look at with a last pick to see how that minute distribution does go. And if he pushes to 30, then he can be top 220, 110, 100, maybe top 100 player with the efficiency, with the assists, with an ability to get steals. But there's probably a limit to what he can actually do overall. But I am excited to see what Kennard can do on this team as we head into the season. Now, Matt, just changing tack a little bit, look at the two-way guys on this team. Reggie Hearn was there last season, and they also brought in Keenan Evans. I'm not massively high on either of those guys. Hearn's an interesting one. I can't seem to get 100% confirmation that he's actually signed to a 2-year, two-way deal. Have you got any news on whether he's actually on this team or not? Because I can't seem to find anything.
He seems to think he is. He said something in Las Vegas that until he hears otherwise, he a deal. Now, like I said, I'm with you. I haven't gotten confirmation about it. I haven't been around the team since the end. I covered the last game of the season against the Chicago Bulls, but I haven't been around the Pistons other than a camp for an individual player here and there. So I couldn't tell you as far as, but like you said, Keenan Evans coming in, a point guard who, in a deep draft, maybe in a worse draft, he might have been a late second round pick. So one of those undrafted rookies that they ended up spelling Kay Felder, making him unrestricted, and he ends up with Toronto with a chance to make that team. He's from Detroit. So we'll see what Keenan Evans. But Reggie Hearn, as far as I know, is that second guy. There were a couple of guys that impressed in Summer League. Johnny Hamilton, a big fellow that went undrafted this past year as well, out of Texas San Antonio, I believe. He's a guy who has been brought into camp as well.
Yep.
To possibly compete for a roster spot. And so there's a couple other guys that they've brought in, but they look like more like G League players. And I think that if Reggie Hearn shows up at camp, then he probably still believes he's that second two-way guy.
Yeah, it's just weird. It's the one player I just cannot get any confirmation. I can't seem to find anything. I understand he's going to be on the team, but I can't get that confirmed anyway. It's pretty weird. Now, let's talk about the new coach. We've got Dwane Casey in here. Van Gundy was there and previously. What is Casey going to bring different to this team? Are we looking at a more up-tempo pace? Are we looking at different sort of combinations or lineup decisions? What are you expecting from a Dwane Casey coach team that we maybe didn't see from a Stan Van Gundy coach team?
It seems like the rotations will be a little bit more rigid and guys will completely know their role, which was, like you said, we talked the Luke Kennard discussion. It was something that was fluid and pretty unpredictable and probably pretty maddening for a lot of the Pistons during his 4-year tenure as coach with Stan Van Gundy at the helm. Now, we know about the way that the Toronto offense evolved last year, and on a lot of the credit, obviously, within the Toronto organization, they believe most of that must have been due to Nick Nurse, the number one assistant coach who was promoted to head coach there. Toronto was third in three-pointers attempted last year at 33 per game. The Pistons were 17th in three-pointers attempted at 28.9. Now, that's a team that made big strides as the Pistons in what they did for prior seasons. So they made strides, especially in their efficiency. They were fifth in three-point percentage as a team this past year, which is something that the Pistons have had such a bad decade here in Detroit that the local fans have kind of tuned it out, which is hard to believe with the popularity of the NBA. But the Pistons are a distant fourth right now in the market in terms of how fans pay attention and are perceiving this team. And because of the struggles they had with a three-point shooting team in the prior 3-4 years, the fact that they actually improved a lot as a three-point shooting team has kind of gotten lost to the casual fan. And I think that that's kind of a huge problem. And it is a problem. It's something that can get better. And like I said, Toronto, third in three-pointers attempted. So maybe you see as a team that improving, that getting something that goes forward better as well. But like I said, the Blake Griffin, maybe the ability for him to isolate a little bit more, even from the top of the key. We're going to see a lot more of the Blake Griffin and Andre Drummond pick and roll, as well as something to keep an eye on. And really, like I said, the development of some of those young guys, talking about Stanley Johnson, talking about Luke Kennard, talking about Henry Ellenson. Those are three guys that are first-round draft picks from the past few years that haven't lived up to it. Luke Kennard, maybe outside of that group because he hasn't had the opportunity and had a pretty solid rookie season. But certainly Henry Ellenson is a guy who was a first-round pick who hasn't shown anything in the NBA. And Stanley Johnson, more bad good with his career. So those guys have to take huge steps forward. And they think that Dwane Casey might be one of the only guys out there who was available as a head coaching candidate who could have turned those guys into good players, and remains to be seen if they're able to make that next step.
The other thing that I think Casey's going to bring that we didn't see from Van Gundy is Stan Van Gundy had, for whatever reason, I don't understand what his thought process was, but he had it burnt into his brain that starting point guards will never play more than 30 minutes per game. He did it in Orlando with Jameer Nelson. He just refused to give them minutes. He did it here in Detroit with Reggie Jackson, would play 28, 29 or 30 minutes per game, and he would never give him more minutes. And he'd be, as we talked about earlier, the rotation would be fluid. Some nights Ish Smith would get more minutes. Now, I think with Casey and his history, of course, Reggie Jackson's not on Kyle Lowry's level, but he was very comfortable giving his better players more minutes. So I think we're going to see more playing time out of Reggie Jackson, assuming he stays healthy. He hasn't even got to 55 games in either of the last two seasons, but the 2 years prior to that, 79 and 77, was able to stay healthy and still only played 30 minutes per night. So if he is able to stay healthy, I think we're seeing a rise in his playing time, which should help his value, and it makes him an interesting later round guy. He's ranked 149th on Yahoo. I think he comfortably can beat that. He's not going to be the number one option scoring-wise on this team. That's Griffin's role, but he's still able to do some things. The thing that always holds Reggie back is three-point shooting and the fact that he gets nothing in terms of steals. He just cannot generate a steal at all, and he's a relatively low assist guy. So that always limits his upside, but I do think that without Van Gundy artificially limiting the playing time of all point guards on this team, that he's got an ability to maybe play an extra 3 or 4 minutes per game this season.
Yeah, but like you said, not only just the injuries that he's had these last couple of years, but those are kind of accumulation injuries. That was a severe ankle sprain that kept him out of last year for much of it, and knee tendonitis is something that from 2 years ago that hasn't really gone away. The problem with Reggie Jackson, and a lot of people used his injury. If you're an optimistic Pistons fan, you said, well, they were really good before he went down on December 26th, but really Reggie was starting to get cold and go through a dry spell and didn't look the same in terms of explosiveness last season, a few weeks before the injury at the end of December. So that's something that gives a little bit of pause in terms of believing the 2016 Reggie Jackson will be able to come back this year. And we'll see. I mean, obviously the point guard rotation is still the same with Ish Smith coming off the bench with one more year left on his contract. But with Reggie Jackson, again, you're probably taking a little bit of a leap of faith there, but one that in 2016 would have paid off pretty well for you.
Ish Smith is the guy you've got listed as the player most likely to be traded. I really push back against the people who say, "Oh, yeah, Smith is a better point guard than Reggie Jackson." I don't believe that. I think Smith is pretty limited in what he can do. He has the occasional strong game that's buoyed by shooting that becomes unsustainable, and then he goes back to being that guy who can't shoot. But he can, when he's out there and when things are cooking, he can get you some assists, he can get you some steals. But he's going to be locked in at that backup role. He has just turned 30 as well, so he's older than you probably imagine Ish Smith to be. So why do you think he is the guy that they, if they are going to trade anyone, that he is the guy that they look? And this is the Pistons team that understand Van Gundy, admittedly different management. They were very, very active in season in the trade market.
Yeah, well, admittedly, there's just not a lot as far as trade options out there for the Pistons with this roster. And the only reason I single him out is because it's an expiring deal, and it's a guy who makes enough money at $6 million a year that it could free them up a little bit away from that the luxury tax, and they're right up against it as far as the luxury tax line, which owner Tom Gores doesn't want to pay right now for a team that's not anywhere near competing for a championship. So that's kind of the only reason I threw that out there. Yeah, of course, Pistons fans want to get rid of John Lure's deal, and a lot of Pistons fans want to get rid of Blake Griffin's deal over the next 4 years as well. But realistically, in terms of an in-season move, something that could happen over the next few months, and Ish Smith is a guy, as you've said, not a starting point guard by any means, not better than Reggie Jackson by any means, but a guy who provides value as kind of a spark plug off the bench, can get your team going in transition, and really be kind of an option offensively for you as you bring in your second unit there. So really a guy that kind of has value, can help the Pistons in terms of a ways that they improve their cap situation by unloading him, and a guy who's a professional who's been around several teams, who knows coaches and knows organizations. I think this is maybe his 10th team that the Pistons are for him, and despite the fact of being just about a 30-year-old guy. So I think it's someone who's displayed the ability to adapt to new situations very well, who could be sought after by a contender at some point.
In the draft, the Pistons came in without a draft pick. They ended with 2 second-round guys, Kyrie Thomas and the Shark, Bruce Brown. Do you see either of these guys playing any sort of role this season, or are they going to be more guys who play with the drive rather than with the Pistons?
I would say that sizing them up, that they're probably both going to spend quite a bit of time in Grand Rapids. But I think as far as one guy who could make a contribution, possibly more so as a rookie, I think it's going to be Kyrie Thomas. And that's just because he has a definite role offensively, in that he's shown the ability in college, and I know it's a different length, but he knocked down the corner three-pointer. In summer league, he gravitated offensively towards that corner, knew his role, knew what he was going to be doing. Both guys are good defensively, which is something that Pistons fans are encouraged about those picks, with Ed Stefanski being the new person in charge of the front office, that he's able to identify the fact that the Pistons need some bulldogs. They need some guys that play well defensively in the backcourt. That was the backbone of these teams that had success in the past, with Joe Dumars types and Chauncey Billups types in the backcourt for the Pistons. So to identify that they should get some rugged guys that can do things defensively, I think that that's a good sign for it. But I think with the fact that offensively Kyrie Thomas has a skill that can be useful right away, I think he has more of a chance to make an impact on the NBA club right away. Whereas Bruce Brown, to his credit, showed a lot of ability to not only be a very, very good rebounder from the guard position, but also showed some playmaking ability and the ability to step in and play some point guard from time to time. He might be more more tabbed as a point guard for the Pistons in the future. But I think that some of those skills, some of those things, those playmaking, the point guard abilities are things that are going to need to be cultivated in Grand Rapids with the drive.
Yeah, I agree with you in that assessment for this season. I think Kyrie plays a little bit more than what Brown does. But overall, long term, I do prefer Brown as a dynasty type asset. I think he does have that ability to handle the ball a little bit as well. Thomas can do that too, but it is going to come down to whether Brown's shot can actually come around, which we haven't seen that at this point. Now, Matt, the projected starting five, the Pistons already have a monopoly on Reggies. You've got two Reggies in the starting lineup here. Amazingly, there is three Reggies in the NBA, and they are all on the Pistons. Reggie Jackson, Reggie Bullock, and Reggie Hearn. We've got Reggie Jackson at point guard here, Reggie Bullock at shooting guard, the little dog, Glenn Robinson III at small forward, Blake Griffin and Andre Drummond. Let's talk Reggie Bullock, because we haven't spoken too much about him. I thought he was really impressive with his ability to shoot 45% from three last season. Doesn't do much else apart from that. He goes out there, is really steady, solid percentages, and he was the 155th ranked player last season. I'm not sure I really see him taking much of a step forward this year, just because I don't see what other areas of his game he's going to be able to improve. But if you're looking at him in terms of a playing time situation, would you look at Bullock as playing more than the 28 minutes per game he played last season, or is he at risk of losing some of those minutes with the addition of Robinson and perhaps Kennard getting more playing time?
Yeah, I think you said it. I think it probably goes down a little bit. I think that, like you said, there's not a whole lot that he can do to improve that's very obvious from the outset. And I think you said 45% from three-point land last year. There's not a whole lot of track record in terms of him being able to maintain that level. So I think that number probably goes down, and that was his most valuable skill last year. So all those things considered, but a guy who does well defensively. So he'll be on the court, certainly, and really – with how thin that backcourt is, how thin those wing positions are for the Pistons, he might be the most established guy out of all those guys, which is pretty sad considering he's not very established at all. So I think that he's still firmly in the rotation, but I think, like you said, with Kennard's maybe emergence and more steady minutes that he'll be getting, I think maybe those minutes go down a little bit.
I'd love to see the Pistons go with Bullock and Kennard together, at least having two 40% three-point shooters alongside Griffin, Drummond, and Jackson, because the other option you got there is Stan Johnson or Glenn Robinson. And Robinson's had some moments as a three-point shooter, but not consistently. So there is that there, but I'm not massive on Bullock for this season. I think it's limited upside, and as I said, I do believe some of his playing time is going to drop. Now, Robinson's season last year was ruined with an ankle injury in Indiana. He comes across to Detroit with an ability to get that starting role, but I'm not really sure what we can look at him. Like, his per 36 numbers aren't really great. He gets steals in okay numbers. The three-point shooting seems to be solid for him, but it is on a really limited number of attempts. I feel like he's almost like a marginally bigger version of what Reggie Bullock is, except he can rebound the ball maybe a bit better.
Yeah, it's really you're basing it on a projection of a player that he tried to grow to become before the injury last season. I think Indiana was pretty high on him going into last season. It was the final day of training camp that he suffered that injury and knocked out most of his season there. Obviously, he had a big impact, and then Indiana goes and has a great season and really has no reason to bring him back. So for the fact that the Pistons might consider starting him going into next season says a lot about the lack of good ability and the lack of track record for some of these guys in the wing. I mentioned that Glenn Robinson would be my choice for a starter right now. It's going to come down to Stanley Johnson or Glenn Robinson for that small forward position, and it's not. I don't have any insight as to how that's going to shake down in training camp, and really it's kind of a pick your poison. I think when you're talking about Glenn Robinson and Stanley Johnson, both pretty decent defenders. Stanley Johnson's proven to be pretty good at times defensively. So I think Johnson gets the upper hand there. Robinson may be a little bit better at creating and rebounding, like you said, although Stanley Johnson's a little bit better in transition. So I think it's a little bit of a matchup in how he melds in with some of those other guys. It seems like Stanley Johnson's more of a guy whose offense might fit in with the bench a little bit more, which is why I went with Glenn Robinson as the starter. And like you said, the ability to hit the corner three at times with Indiana, whereas Stanley Johnson has not shown the ability to knock down threes consistently in any way, shape, or form. And his misses are as bad as some of the worst misses you can find in the NBA in terms of some of those three-pointers. So I think that just the way that they fit in with those lineups. I think that Stanley makes a little bit more sense on the bench. Although if Dwane Casey wants to throw his best defensive lineup out there, when you talk about guys like Blake Griffin and Reggie Jackson, who are minus defenders themselves, then maybe that edge that Stanley Johnson has defensively precludes Casey to putting him into that starting lineup. And we'll see what move he makes with that small forward spot.
Johnson's also a considerably better ball handler and passer and decision maker than Robinson in that area. But much like that shooting guard position, I think it's going to be sort of an even-ish mix. Some nights you'll see them play together at the 3-4. Some nights it'll be more Stan. Some nights it'll be more Robinson. And neither of those guys really projects as a good fantasy guy. They are, I think, both top 200 guys. And with Robinson having a rank of outside the top 360, then for deeper leagues, that's really, really strong value. And I'd be looking at him there. Same with Johnson, but I don't really see them being big guys to step forward and take an additional role. Now, the main guy on this team from a fantasy point of view is Andre Drummond. He was the 20th ranked player last season, 15 points and 16 boards. But the impressive parts here were the 3 assists, the 1.5 steals, 1.6 blocks, and 53 from the field, and of course 61% from the free throw line, which was almost a 30 percentage point increase in what he'd done the previous season. And we can get caught up in that improvement, and it's really good. But from a fantasy point of view, it's still an issue in that category, and you still probably have to punt it despite him becoming that good. And even then, towards the end of the season, it did start to drop back off. Now, the other thing with Drummond is, again, he was the 20th ranked player. He's always been an excellent guy in terms of getting steals as a big man. The field goal percentage has risen back up now that Van Gundy decided that maybe getting him to post up all the time wasn't the best idea. That was nonsense at the time, and it remained nonsense. That sort of reduced, but the staggering number to me is that Andre Drummond, when he was on the court without Blake Griffin, he averaged 5.4 assists per 100 possessions. And when he shared the court with Blake Griffin, it went down to 1.5. So we're talking about cutting in or by more than a third, or down to a third of the number in terms of the assists. And that number that he was getting last year, the 3 assists, and that was up around 4 before Griffin arrived, really boosted his value. And I think it's going to come way down. That doesn't impact his overall numbers too much. He's still probably a third round guy, but if you're expecting that same number, even if you look at his averages from last season where he did have the 3 assists, I think you're going to be disappointed because he's not going to get that same level of playmaking when Griffin's on the court, and Griffin's the one operating out of the high post instead of Drummond.
Yeah, it was that was one of the questionable things about Stan Van Gundy throughout all last year is he did not do a good job of solving the Blake Griffin, Andre Drummond puzzle right away, especially given the fact that the great start that the Pistons had as a team had a lot to do with the fact that Andre Drummond was away from the basket, doing a lot of the dribble handoffs, making a lot of the passes from away from the basket. And like you said, precluded to some of those really good assist numbers early on. Yeah, I mean, when Blake Griffin had the ball in his hands and was basically doing a lot of the same things that Andre Drummond was asked to do earlier in the year, that and you mentioned some of the post-ups that were that give Pistons fans nightmares over the past few years. Those actually back a little bit at the end of last year. You saw more of those in the past 20 games or so than you did in the first 60, and that's a scary thought that that's something that could come back. Now, if you're paying attention to Andre Drummond's social media, there might be another weapon coming, and it's something that might even be even scarier for Pistons fans, and that's the fact that he's working on a three-point shot. I would point you to a recent article from James Edwards III of The Athletic, pointing out that there's no evidence of him being able to hit the mid-range shot. He hasn't been anyone who knocks down any kind of jump shot throughout his career so far. And for guys that come out of nowhere in terms of big guys that can start knocking down three-pointers as their career goes on in the NBA, that's kind of been the thing that shows whether they're able to do it or not. If they're knocking down mid-range shots before they did that.
Brook Lopez, no evidence Marc Gasol, those guys.
Yeah, exactly. And Powell was so good at it or throughout most of his career, and then with the Spurs became a guy who can knock down three-pointers as well. And then again, to his credit, to Andre's credit, there was no evidence that he would improve his free throw percentage 20 points in one season as well. But still a pretty big leap of faith to put on something that there's really no evidence that will come through. So, but maybe it will, maybe late in shot clock or maybe throwing up a couple threes a game early on in the season to see if it's something he can do. But I will say this for Andre's credit, while Stan Van Gundy was having trouble figuring out ways to keep him at the productive clip that he had throughout most of his overall stats during early on in the season. After Blake did come over, Andre's rebounding numbers did go up. He was up to 17.1 per game after the trade, where he was at 15.3 before that. So, in the midst of the fact that he was taking away a lot of his offensive responsibilities, he was able to kind of roam a little bit more and be strictly a rebounder, and was able to get that done. So, I mean, yeah, like you said, the assist numbers probably go down, but maybe the rebounding numbers even go up a little bit.
Yeah, that's exactly how I've got it for Drummond this season. He's going to remain an elite steals guy as a center as well. Block shots, the field goal percentage, I think will probably come down a bit with those 3-point shots. And that's going to be something to really pay attention to in preseason. And we saw that with Dedmon last season. We saw it with Gasol and Lopez in previous seasons, that they started taking these threes. Even Al Horford went, well, hang on, they've never done this before. And they started doing it, and they did it with volume, and it carried over. And that'll be something to watch to see exactly how Drummond does that. Casey experimented a little bit with that with Jonas Valanciunas last season as he started taking some threes and hitting them. But Jonas is a better shooter than what Drummond is, so that will be interesting to watch. In terms of this team and the fantasy ranks on this team, I think most guys are in the right spot. I don't think there's a huge amount of value or bust potential there. Maybe you could say Griffin at 42 with the injury risk is a little bit high, but everyone else seems to be in the right spot. I like Kennard and Jackson as late round type of guys. They're ranked 149th and 136 respectively on Yahoo, and they could very easily jump in the top 110, but it's not massive value, and everyone else seems to be pretty much in the right spot on this team, Matt, in terms of their projections. We touched a little bit on Henry Allenson before. He has been dreadful pretty much through his first 2 NBA seasons. He took every single shot he could possibly take in Summer League. Didn't hit them, but he took them, and that was clearly on the advice of the coaching staff to be more aggressive. But with Anthony Tolliver moving on, is there any hope for him to actually find a role on this team behind Blake Griffin, or is it just, maybe we should be declining this guy's fourth-year option?
Yeah, it's going to be a choice that they're going to have to make right before the season starts, and I think he's going to get the chance. I think they're going to pick up the option just because what you're going to have to find on the open market in terms of a replacement is going to be more expensive. So I think he's going to get that chance that they're going to probably pick up the option, and I think that he's going to get some minutes as the fifth big guy there. Now, obviously, that's going to be marginalized a little bit when you probably put Glenn Robinson at the 4, some small lineups there. So maybe the fifth big guy isn't going to get very many minutes, but he's one injury away from a guy that's going to get some consistent minutes on the front court. And when you talk about the age of Pachulia and the history of Blake Griffin, that's certainly something that could happen very quickly. And John Lewis throw in there as well as a guy who has injury history now too. So, like you said, a gifted offensive player in some ways, a dreadful defensive player, and that's the main reason that he couldn't get a role with Stan Van Gundy, consistently. But the fact that they threw him out there in Summer League as a third-year player going into Summer League, and something to keep in mind if you want to be optimistic about Henry Ellenson is despite the fact that the Pistons added 2 rookies from the draft and Luke Kennard was a first-round pick last year, Henry Ellenson going to his third year is still the youngest player on the Pistons roster by about a couple months with some of the rookies there as well. So, there's a chance, and he's a gym rat. He's a guy who obviously, can do things. His shot form looks pretty good. Like you said, Summer League, he threw a lot of shots up. He got some looks, but they just didn't go down. There's no indication that they will go down at a consistent level in the NBA, but he's a guy who looks pretty good when he's shooting in a gym. But unfortunately for him, his defensive problems and his lack of ability to put together a consistent offensive stretch as an NBA player has haunted him and will continue to until he's able to prove otherwise.
Yeah, exactly. The defensive stuff is a real problem. He needs to, if you're going to be that much of a problem defensively like Ryan Anderson is, you've got to hit your threes, and hitting them at 32% isn't going to cut them, which is what Allenson was at last, or 33%, which is what he was at last season, and 36% overall from the floor. Matt, that'll wrap it up with the Detroit Pistons, and that wraps up my season preview series for all the teams. But let everyone know what you've got cracking over on Locked On Pistons at the moment.
Well, if I could add 2 more things for fantasy purposes, if players are playing weekly leagues or they're looking at daily stuff, Blake Griffin's guy who, and I agree with your assessment of overall terms of value. I think he's just a consistent player. I think if you're looking for a guy in a daily fantasy who's going to get you a certain amount of points, if you look at the the seasons as a whole. He's a guy who's going to grab those numbers. Unlike Andre Drummond, whose numbers might be up and down per game, Blake Griffin's probably more of a consistent guy. And Stanley Johnson might be a guy to keep an eye on in terms of whether he's getting on a roll through a certain stretch. You might want to swoop him up just for that short period of time, because he's shown the ability to have a week, maybe 2 weeks in a row where he's a very good player. But if it's going bad, cut bait right away and get him out of that lineup. But thanks for having me on, Josh. And you can find us on Twitter at Locked On Pistons. My Twitter handle is Matt _ and then Schoch, which is SCHOCH, another underscore after that. I got the Facebook page at Locked On Pistons _ Matt Schoch. And Josh, looking forward to having you on the show sometime soon during the season with the Pistons as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. Thank you for coming on and discussing the Pistons. Go and listen to Matt's podcast, Locked On Pistons, and subscribe, and do the same with this one. 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, TuneIn, Stitcher, Spotify, and you can find this show on YouTube where you can go leave a comment and leave me a thumbs up. Matt, thank you once again.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Guys, we are done here. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya. Bruce Brown Jr.